Some crimes make headlines. Others are swallowed by time, buried in cold case files and whispered legends. From the shores of the Great Lakes to the darkest corners of the world, we uncover the killers, cults, and crimes that haunt history. Welcome to the Great Lakes Crime Club, where the stories run darker than the waters. It's the summer of 1968 at Blisswood, a quiet cabin community outside of the city of Good Hart in Michigan. The summer breeze carries with it a strange, foul odor. Neighbors playing cards outside start to wrinkle their noses, unaware of the nightmare that's about to unfold here. A gentleman named Monty Bliss owns a cabin at Blisswood, and he's far more familiar with them than most. He and his father built Blisswood. Monty supposes that a raccoon has died, so he sets out to investigate. He approaches Somerset, one of the cabins at Blisswood. He sees that the windows are dark. One pane of glass has been punctured by bullet holes, hastily patched from the inside with cardboard. There's a hand-scrawled note taped to the front door. It says, "Be back by 7:10, Robison." But July 10th is long past. The Robisons are the owners of Somerset. It's their home away from home. Monty supposes that the bullet holes came from the Robison children who might have been plinking away at it with air rifles. When Monty approaches the door, he notices something odd. The cabin has been locked such that it can only be opened from the inside, but using a pry bar he's able to lift the latch. However, nothing could have prepared Monty for the horror that he was about to stumble upon. Inside he finds the air thick with decay. 6 bodies lie strewn about, an entire family dead for weeks. It's a slaughter so shocking that when police arrive they have to don gas masks to investigate the terrible scene. The discovery on July 22, 1968, nearly a month after the murders, sent shockwaves through the community. Richard Robison, 42, his wife Shirley, 40, and their 4 children, Richie, 19, Gary, 16, Randy, 12, and Susan, 7, were found brutally murdered in their summer cottage. The crime immediately became one of the worst mass murders in Michigan state history. How could an entire family be wiped out in their vacation home, unseen and unheard of, for 27 days? The case, now known as the Robison family murders or the Good Hart murders, officially remains unsolved. But from the beginning, investigators unearthed a tangled web of clues, forensic evidence, financial deception, and strange behavior from a man close to the Robison family. Join us as we delve into the story, the investigation that ensued, and the dark secrets that surfaced when evil came to Good Hart. The Robisons were a wealthy family from a suburb of Detroit, seemingly living the American dream. Richard "Dick" Robison was a successful advertising executive and magazine publisher who ran his own agency in Southfield, Michigan. Shirley was his devoted wife of 20 years. Together, they raised 4 well-mannered children. The family didn't drink, smoke, or gamble, and they had no known enemies, and they lived a comfortable life. That summer, 1968, Dick and Shirley decided to take the kids to their cabin in Good Hart, a woodsy resort along the Lake Michigan shore. It was meant to be a summer of relaxation and a few large purchases. Dick had plans to purchase a horse farm in Kentucky and some property in Florida. He'd also been hinting to friends about a big deal on the horizon that would make him a wealthy tycoon. He spoke excitedly of a mysterious investor known to him as Mr. Roberts, who'd be joining the family at their cabin to discuss the business plan and then join them on their trip. But the dream of a perfect summer away was shattered on the evening of June 25th, 1968. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, that was the evening the Robison family would meet their gruesome end. The day began normally enough. The Robisons had been at the cabin now for over a week. That morning, Dick made a phone call from the cottage to his banker in Detroit. He was expecting a deposit of $200,000, which was money that he planned to use for the secret venture that would make him a wealthy tycoon. Instead, the banker gave him startling news. Not only had the expected deposit not arrived, but the bank account balance was just $15,000, which was far lower than what Dick had understood the account balance to be. Stunned and alarmed, Dick immediately called the office to speak to his right-hand man, 30-year-old Joseph "Joe" Scalero. An Army veteran who had attended Harvard, Joe became Dick's first employee. When the family departed for their vacation, Dick asked Joe to handle the day-to-day operations of the company on his behalf. According to the receptionist, Dick was furious on the phone and he demanded to speak with Joe right away. Some heated words were exchanged. At about 10:30 a.m., witnesses say that Joe abruptly left the Southfield office, cutting the call short. He told colleagues he had to attend to something and then vanished for the rest of the day. Back up north in the quiet of Good Hart, Dick was on edge. Something wasn't right. As the sun began to dip near the horizon, the Robison family went about their usual vacation routines. Some of the children were playing cards in the cabin's living area to pass the time. Richard sat in an easy chair, perhaps trying to calm his nerves after the upsetting call from that morning. Shirley and the younger kids were nearby, winding down for the evening. Outside, the dense woods began to grow dim. A team of tree trimmers that Dick had hired were departing after a long day of work. Little did they know that they would be the last people to see the Robison family alive. Sometime later that evening, a killer made their move. From the cover of the dark trees, the killer raised a .22 caliber rifle and fired through a window of the cabin without any warning. One round struck Dick in the chest as he sat in his chair, gravely wounding him. Chaos began to erupt inside as Dick doubled over, mortally wounded. His family had just mere seconds to react. The gunman then burst through the cabin's door, brandishing not just the rifle but also a .25 caliber pistol. In a frenzied onslaught, he turned the gun on the others. 12-year-old Randy and his mother, Shirley, were gunned down almost instantly in the living room. Susan tried to run, but the attacker shot her as she fled down a hallway. 19-year-old Richie and 16-year-old Gary had been playing solitaire just moments before. Having heard the gunfire, they bolted toward a back bedroom where a hunting rifle was stored in a closet. It was their only chance to fight back, but unfortunately, they wouldn't make it. The killer caught up just as they reached the doorway and shot both boys in the back and head, cutting them down before they could arm themselves. In the span of just a few minutes, the Robison family lay dead or dying, but the murderer's grim work was not quite finished. Amid the haze of gun smoke, the killer moved methodically through the cottage to finish off any survivors. 7-year-old Susan, who was miraculously still clinging to life after being shot, was bludgeoned in the head with a claw hammer, a cruel final blow. Each of the victims, even those already shot, received a close-range pistol shot to the head. Shirley, too, would be bludgeoned with the claw hammer. All 6 Robisons had just been brutally slain. Outside, the gunfire and screams echoed into the woods. Normally, such a commotion might have drawn attention, but Good Hart was sparsely populated. The nearest neighboring cottage was about 100 yards away, and those neighbors weren't home that night. A couple about a quarter mile away did hear what sounded like distant gunshots, but then again, gunshots aren't an uncommon sound up in northern Michigan, so they assumed it was just a family that was engaging in some target practice and chose not to investigate any further. In the aftermath of the slaughter, the murderer took steps to cover up his tracks. Inside the cabin, only a single bloody footprint hinted at the intruder's presence, suggesting that the killer moved carefully. He drew all the curtains closed and taped cardboard over the bullet holes in the window, hoping to hide any signs of the violence from outside. Chillingly, he then went to the thermostat and turned up the heat full blast in an attempt to accelerate decomposition in the warm summer weeks ahead, which would thereby destroy evidence. Finally, the killer locked the doors and slipped away into the night, leaving just the note that says, "Be back by 7:10. It was a deceptive message, intended for neighbors to think that the family would be away for some time. For almost 4 weeks, the Robison cabin lay silent and locked, hiding the brutal scene. Friends and neighbors back home grew concerned when they hadn't heard from the Robisons, but they assumed that they just extended their vacation. At the resort, the caretaker and owner, Chauncey Bliss, noticed nothing amiss until well after the date that was written on the note. By mid-July, as the summer heat swelled, a putrid smell began to seep from the cabin. Finally, on July 22nd, a neighbor just couldn't stand it anymore and complained of the pungent odor coming from the direction of the Robisons' cottage. Chauncey was speaking with his son, Monty, and they decided to investigate what they believed was a dead raccoon. This is when Monty stumbled across the grim scene of the cabin. In the front room lay the badly decomposed bodies of Dick, Shirley, and their daughter, Susan. Dick's body had a gunshot wound to the chest, with Randy's body draped over him and a rug draped over them both. Susan lay on the floor next to her father and brother with a bloody wound to her face. In the living room, Shirley Robison lay face down, with a red and black plaid blanket covering her body. Further back in a bedroom doorway, Richie lay dead from multiple gunshots to the head, and Gary's body was found on the bedroom floor, shot in the back and head. Bullet holes riddled the floors and walls of the cabin. Blood was everywhere, soaked into the rugs, splattered on furniture, and the stench of death was overpowering. Monty Bliss staggered out and contacted the police. Investigators from the Emmett County Sheriff's Office and Michigan State Police arrived at the scene. They would find that the bodies were in such an advanced state of decomposition that it would be really challenging to determine specific clues. The summer heat, intensified by the killer tampering with the thermostat, had done considerable work to the bodies, destroying any potential traces of evidence. Forensic teams began meticulously documenting the scene. They recovered 15 spent shell casings, 11 from a .22 caliber and 4 from a .25 caliber firearm, which confirmed that 2 guns had been used. A claw hammer stained with blood was also found, indicating its use in the brutal attack. As someone who watches a lot of true crime, when I was researching this case, a certain detail leapt out to me right away. Both Shirley and Susan had additional violent damage to their faces from the claw hammer. Research suggests that abuse to the face indicates that the killer knew the victim and wanted to depersonalize them by making them unrecognizable. Then there was the blanket used to cover Shirley's body after her death. This kind of action has been hypothesized to show that the killer knew the victim and felt shame for the murder that they committed. Shocked by the carnage, police and journalists alike struggled to describe what had happened. This was the largest mass murder that Michigan had seen up until that time. The once orderly cabin was now carpeted with dead flies, and it would be written off as irredeemable. The scene was so gruesome that the cabin itself would be demolished. The blood, the odor, could never be fully cleaned. So who would have committed such an atrocity? And why? Those were the questions on everyone's mind as the investigation began. From the outset, detectives surmised this was no random act of violence. The remote location, the extreme measures taken to conceal the crime, and the complete annihilation of the family suggested that this was a targeted, calculated massacre rather than some spontaneous robbery gone wrong. Plus, the Robisons were a well-off family. Dick's wallet, Shirley's purse, well, they were found in the cottage. Nothing obvious was stolen like cash or jewelry. Michigan State Police and Emmett County Sheriff's Office investigators formed a joint task force. They started by reconstructing the Robisons' final days and interviewing anyone who had recent contact with the family. Autopsies would confirm that each family member died from the gunshot wounds, meaning that any damage inflicted by the claw hammer was done post-mortem. The time of death was hard to pinpoint because of decompositions, but based on statements from the tree trimmers, well, police concluded the murders occurred on June 25th, 1968, the same day Richard had that altercation over the phone. Ballistic analysis identified the murder weapons as a .22 caliber semi-automatic AR-7 rifle and a .25 caliber semi-automatic Beretta 950B. Both firearms were small and easily portable. The AR-7 rifle could be broken down for transport with its constituent components stored inside of its stock. The Beretta was a pocket-sized pistol no longer than the palm of a hand, and neither weapon remained at the scene. The killer disappeared along with them. But the shell casings and the bullet fragments were enough to tell a story, so the forensic team started to carefully collect them for analysis. One crucial clue was that single bloody footprint on the floor. It indicated the perpetrator likely acted alone, since only one set of footprints was found amidst the carnage. Investigators theorized that the killer may have stepped in the blood while moving a body or surveying the scene. The print was clear enough to reveal a specific sole pattern. At first, authorities had to consider a frightening possibility. Could this have been the work of a wandering mass murderer or a madman who stumbled across the cottage? In the late 1960s, Americans were starting to grow familiar with the idea of random, motiveless killings. It wouldn't be long before the nation would learn of the Manson family crimes, and in Michigan that same year, a serial killer had been targeting young women, the so-called Ypsilanti Ripper. Some locals wondered if that psychopath could have descended on Good Hart. Others whispered about whether someone had a grudge against Dick Robison, or if a contract killer might have been hired because of a bad business deal. One of the first leads the investigators pursued was the Traverse City State Hospital, also known as the Northern Michigan Asylum. Due to its proximity to Good Hart, investigators wondered if an escapee could have wandered north, or if perhaps someone who'd recently been released may have had the means and motive to commit the murders. Several people would be interviewed, but alibis checked out. As detectives dug deeper, one name kept resurfacing in their interviews and evidence: Joseph Scalero. This was Dick Robison's right-hand man, the employee who'd been heard arguing with Dick on the phone the day that he was murdered. Joe was believed to have visited the Robison family at their Good Hart cottage before, so police believe he'd have known exactly where it was and how to navigate the winding roads to get there. Investigators soon learned about the heated phone call, how Dick had discovered money missing and confronted Joe, and how Joe subsequently left work abruptly and went incommunicado for the rest of the day. To police, Joe was looking more and more like a prime suspect. He had means, familiarity with guns from his time in the military, motive, possible financial wrongdoing being uncovered, and opportunity, no alibis during the time of the murders. So with growing suspicion, detectives focused on Joe's activities and background. Joseph Raymond Scalero was, by all outward appearances, a clean-cut, intelligent young businessman. In Dick's absence that summer, Joe had been running the day-to-day operations of the business. The Robisons treated him like a family friend. Joe dined at their home and was believed to have spent time at their cottage as a guest before. No one would have ever imagined he was capable of such violence. But investigators would soon uncover a dark side behind Joe's affable demeanor. A forensic audit of the Robison Company accounts revealed that over the preceding months, large sums of money had quietly drained out of the business. Suspicious checks and expenditures pointed to embezzlement. In fact, auditors found that the financial irregularities began just after Joe had been hired. So it appeared Joe had been pilfering money from his boss, also likely forging Dick's signature on checks or even maybe abusing pre-signed checks that were made for Dick's absence. Dick had just started to realize that money was missing on that fateful day when he effectively caught Joe red-handed. This gave Joe a powerful motive: desperation. If Dick had uncovered the full extent of his embezzlement, well, his career and reputation would be ruined, and he could even face time in prison. Beyond the missing money, there was another financial angle. Detectives learned that Joe believed Dick had recently taken out a $200,000 Keyman life insurance policy on himself, with the company as beneficiary. If true, Dick's death might result in a payout that could benefit the business or its remaining staff, or maybe even Joe himself. But in reality, Dick had applied for that policy, but he hadn't completed the required medical exam, so the policy wasn't yet in effect. However, still, if Joe thought the policy was active, he might have seen that as another upside to Dick's demise on top of evading his embezzlement. So money, it seemed, could be at the heart of the crime. Joe's behavior on and after June 25th raised red flags. When questioned, he couldn't account for his whereabouts during the crucial window from late morning on June 25th until later that night. His wife Laura confirmed to police that Joe's sudden disappearance that day was highly unusual. In their 6 years of marriage, he'd never failed to come home in time for dinner, until that night. Effectively, Joe had no alibi for about 12 hours, plenty of time to make the 4-hour drive up to Good Hart, commit the murders, and return home. Investigators quickly began tracing Joe's movements, looking for any evidence that he'd been near Good Hart that night. They also inquired about any firearms he owned. Early on, it was public knowledge that 2 guns were used in the crime. Joe readily admitted that he owned guns of those exact calibers. In fact, he claimed to have purchased 2 small Beretta .25 caliber pistols, but said he gave one of them to Dick as a gift sometime before the murders. He also said that he'd acquired 2 Armalite AR-7 .22 rifles, supposedly buying them from a relative, but then he said that he'd since given those rifles to other people months prior. It was an oddly specific story, almost too specific. Joe was essentially admitting that yes, I possessed weapons just like the murder weapons, but I also conveniently no longer have them. To support his story, Joe volunteered the one firearm that remained in his possession, the .25 caliber Beretta, for the police to test. When the state police lab tested that particular pistol, they found that it was not the one that fired the fatal bullets. But this didn't clear Joe. Investigators understood the possibility that the other identical pistol that he purchased might have been the murder weapon. You know, the one that was conveniently missing because he said that he gave it to Dick. Detectives dug deeper and soon uncovered evidence that was devastating to Joe's claims. At a private firing range owned by Joe's father-in-law, investigators found spent .22 shell casings that matched those at the murder scene. Witnesses reported seeing Scalero target shooting with an AR-7 rifle there not long before the murders. This implied that one of Joe's AR-7 rifles had been used in the crime, and that Joe had practiced firing it at that range. The ammunition recovered at the murder scene and the firing range also kind of became a smoking gun of sorts. The bullets and casings from the .25 caliber pistol were from a brand called Seiko, a Finnish-made brand that was rare in the US. In fact, it had only been sold in Michigan for a brief period in early 1968. Investigators checked sales records and learned that Joe was among the very few people who bought Seiko .25 caliber rounds in Michigan that year. In fact, he purchased them the same day that he bought the 2.25 caliber Beretta pistols in February of 1968. Remember the bloody footprint with a clear sole impression? Detectives managed to match that to a specific make of boot. When they searched Joe's belongings, sure enough, they found that he owned a pair of boots with that exact same sole pattern. Strangely though, the boots in Joe's closet looked almost new, as if they'd never been worn. Investigators suspected that Joe might have purchased an identical pair of boots, such that he could produce them as proof that his boots were unused and thus he couldn't have left the print. By late 1968, the evidence piling up against Joe Scalero was damning. When confronted by police, Joe grew evasive. He had no solid explanation for the evidence. He denied driving to Good Hart on June 25th, but he couldn't prove where he was. He denied killing the Robisons, but investigators were certain that they had their man. To further probe his guilt, investigators asked him to take a polygraph test. Joe would take 3. He failed 2 of them outright, and the third was deemed to be inconclusive. According to the examiner, even in the pre-test interviews, Joe's responses were indicative of deception. It seemed to the Emmett County investigators and Michigan State Police that all roads led to Joseph Scalero. As one author later put it, Scalero, like many other notorious killers of that era, wore a mask of sanity, appearing like a normal, upstanding citizen to those around him, but underneath lurked a man capable of unspeakable violence when cornered. In a sense, he was a red-collar criminal, a white-collar embezzler who turned to murder to cover up his fraud. Investigators theorized that when Dick confronted Joe about the missing money, Joe panicked, fearing that his life was about to collapse, so he made a cold-blooded decision to eliminate the Robison family to cover up his crimes. Despite the mountain of circumstantial and forensic evidence pointing to Joe, the case wasn't without its puzzles and side trails. For a time, investigators and the press explored alternate suspects and theories. One such mystery was the so-called Mr. Roberts that Dick had mentioned before his death. Who was this wealthy stranger that Dick was expecting at the cottage? Investigators dug into Dick's business dealings and uncovered hints of a secret group of investors with names like Mr. Roberts, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Peters, names that were vague enough to sound like aliases. And Dick's body was found with a St. Christopher medal that was engraved with a dedication from Mr. Robert, calling Dick his chosen son and heir. It was all very cryptic. Was this part of an elaborate con that Dick had fallen for? Or could one of those figures have been involved with the murders? Police ultimately found no evidence that any Mr. Roberts ever arrived in Michigan or even existed as a person. Close to the scene, investigators also considered the residence of Good Hart. The man who discovered the bodies, Monty Bliss, came under brief scrutiny, but Bliss's genuine shock was evident, and he had no conceivable motive. Some townspeople gossiped that Bliss might have been upset with Dick over a personal matter, but this was pure gossip without any substance. There was no indication that Bliss had any role in the murders, and authorities were quick to rule him out as a suspect. Ultimately, as investigators considered the other possibilities, they kept coming back to the same conclusion, that the simplest explanation was the correct one. The evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Joe Scalero. By the end of 1969, the case had been effectively solved on paper. Investigators had compiled a massive case file implicating Joe Scalero, but no arrest was made. The reason? The local prosecutor was hesitant to bring charges. Emmett County Prosecutor Donald Noggle was newly elected. In fact, he got the job via write-in vote in 1968. He had no prior experience with a homicide case of this magnitude. A 6-victim murder trial promised to be incredibly complex, lengthy, and expensive for the small county. Reportedly, the county commissioners were reluctant to allocate funds for prosecution. Shockingly, they even balked at paying for all the autopsies at first. By December of 1969, after reviewing the evidence, Noggle declared that there was insufficient evidence to charge Joe. He cited the lack of a murder weapon and the entirely circumstantial, although strong, nature of the case. This decision frustrated detectives who were convinced they had their man. The Robison case went into a limbo, open but inactive. For the next few years, it remained officially unsolved, and law enforcement continued to keep an eye on Joe. Joe, for his part, attempted to move on with his life. Imagine living under a cloud of suspicion, rumored to be a mass murderer yet never formally accused. Scalero continued to live in the Detroit suburbs and was running Dick's business into the ground. Their largest client, Delta Faucet, dumped them after determining that more than $100,000 of ad revenue had been swindled by Joe. By 1972, a new prosecutor in a different jurisdiction took interest. Ronald Rumenap in Oakland County lacked the ability to indict since the murders occurred in Emmett County. But unlike Noggle, Rumenap told investigators that he believed there was enough evidence to charge Joe with the crimes. Finally, in early 1973, Emmett County authorities signaled they were ready to move. It's said that in March, Joe got wind that an indictment for 6 counts of murder was imminent. In his office in Bloomfield Township, Joe wrote 2 letters, one addressed to his mother. Then he took out a gun, aimed it at his head, and pulled the trigger. He was dead at 34 years of age. When police arrived at the scene, they found Joe's body and his final letters. A note was posted on the office door for his mother, warning her not to enter. Another was his confession of sorts. He admitted to being a liar, a cheat, and a fraud, acknowledging his embezzlement and forgeries. However, he specifically denied one thing. The letters ended with, "I had nothing to do with the Robison murders. I'm a liar, but not a murderer." With Joe dead, the case against him couldn't move forward. Officially, the Robison family murders remain an unsolved case. No one was ever convicted. But in every practical sense, the investigation identified the killer. Authorities declared Joe the prime and sole suspect. It was a resolution, but one without any justice. Throughout the years, the case continued to fascinate true crime aficionados and journalists. Some wonder if Joe could have truly done it all alone. Others wonder if the mysterious business deal Dick was working on could have entangled him with some dark figures. While I tend to believe that Joe acted alone, the necklace with an engraving from Mr. Robert does make me incredibly curious about what's going on there. Dick was adopted, but it's unclear if he knew this before his death. Did he figure out who his biological father was? Or was this something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you even heard about this case before? If so, it's possible that you came across it due to a potential link to the Zodiac Killer. The Detroit News had a program in the 1960s where readers could submit letters with tips about crimes. In 1968, a person sent in a letter claiming to have information on the Robison murders, but they said they'd only supply the information if the newspaper put an ad in the personal section saying, quote, "Dr. Guidini, your prescription is good, however, need additional, Zodius," end quote. Since this supposed informant was never heard from again and there were no responses to the ad, I believe that it was a hoax. But there is a theory on the internet that the Zodiac killer ended up in Michigan in 1968 and is floating around Reddit and some other true crime forums. Personally, I don't think that's accurate. In Good Hart, Blisswood still exists as a small resort near Harbor Springs. Some locals are old enough to remember the horrific summer when crime shattered the tranquility. The murders were tragic enough, but the case is sadly an example of tragedy upon tragedy. The Robison family and the community of Good Hart never got justice, although I do truly believe Joe Scalero was guilty. But this case is a reminder that even when the truth seems clear, closure can remain out of reach. Every crime leaves a story. Some are well known, others are just waiting to be told, and we're just getting started. If you love unraveling the unknown, be sure to subscribe, if you dare, and hit the bell. New cases drop soon and you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you with the next case.